Well, thank you for that very nice introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. I had the pleasure of doing a presentation this morning or this afternoon at the Gregory School. And as you heard, I work with the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and I'm the curator for Slavery and Freedom. I was honored to be able to co-curate the Slavery and Freedom exhibition in the museum. And I do lots of work, not just curating, but also writing, publishing, public programs, and more. I have a project going on in St. Croix and also in Mobile, Alabama with Africatown, the historic community that was born out of those who survived the crossover, the Atlantic from Benin to Mobile, Alabama during the illegal slave trade. So today I want to talk to you about really African Americans' Reconstruction and the Black vote. I, again, as I mentioned, work at the museum. We've been open since 2016. It was an idea that came into being around 1916, brought up by several African American men who formerly fought with the U.S. colored troops, and they thought that it was necessary to have a monument dedicated to African Americans and their contributions to the nation in terms of the military. And so it took 100 years for this to come into being, and since we've opened, we've had about 7 million visitors. This is an image of the inside of the history galleries. You see here is where people queue up to go downstairs and start at the bottom. The history gallery is foundational to the rest of the museum. I want to point out to you here this slave cabin. The slave cabin came from Edisto Island, South Carolina, and on the front we interpret it in terms of slavery and freedom. But on the back we interpret it in terms of freedom, emancipation, and Reconstruction period. At that time, 1866, the black codes went into play. Those black codes defined us as vagrants if we were not out back in those fields, living in those same slave cabins, signed onto a contract in another form of slavery. So we look at that and we look at the Reconstruction amendments. But I want you to keep in mind, underneath this rail car, we have the story of the domestic slave trade. The domestic slave trade, two of the most successful dealers during the time were Isaac Franklin and John Armfield. Isaac Franklin took his profit, turned it into power, and bought 8 plantations. So you have this guard tower from Angola Prison. Angola Prison is on the site of former Angola Plantation. Angola Plantation was formerly owned by Isaac Franklin. And so it gets us from slavery and freedom to the convict leased labor system. We have a prison cell from that same prison, one of the worst prisons in the nation. And that prison cell is upstairs in our community gallery, and that allows us to talk about the prison industrial complex. The point is that all of this is connected. We don't talk about this history in a vacuum. I can tell you that people go through this exhibition and they read every label. People stay in our museum for 6 hours. The norm to stay in a museum is about 2 hours. And it's black, it's white, it's young, it's old, it's everyone. So what brought me to all of this, and why am I talking about voting and African Americans? This is an image in Oklahoma of educators. There's a man in this photo right here. That's my grandfather.
See there?
He's the only black man in that room. He was the principal of Carver Junior High School in Enid, Oklahoma. He was the principal of Booker T. Washington High School in Sapulpa, Oklahoma. And I remember I wondered what was it like for him when I'd look through these pictures and see this one black man amongst all these white people. What was life like for him? This is a picture of my mother. We moved from Oklahoma City to Washington, D.C. One of the last communities to integrate was Glen Echo, Maryland. She was the only black woman in that scene. Why? Because this was the holiday party at the school my sister attended. John Gandhi was the first cousin to my great-grandfather. John Gandhi was the president of Virginia State University from 1914 until the 1940s. He had an unpublished autobiography held in the archives at Virginia State University. And in it, he wrote, "This is where I was born. My mother was this woman. Her sister was this woman. Her mother was this woman. They were owned by this man and this woman." Colonel Adly Hogan Gladden gave my mother, her sister, and her mother to his brother-in-law, Thomas Watt. He then carried them directly from South Carolina to Oktibbeha County, Mississippi. This is the location of Mississippi State University. So I wondered, well, where is this place? I've never heard of it. All I've heard about is Oklahoma. And so my mother and I took his unpublished autobiography, we didn't know anyone, and we flew into Mississippi. We rode up to a gas station in Oktibbeha County, and we said to ourselves, the first black person we see, we're going to ask them where this is. And this woman pulled up with her daughter, and she said, follow me, I'll show you. We rode past Mississippi State University. There was a fork in the road. She said, you can go either way. You'll come full circle. When we cleared the trees, it was open spaces. You could tell where all the plantations were. We ended up finding plantations, churches, schools, all the sites that he mentioned in his unpublished autobiography. This again is John Gandhi. This is his mother, this is his father, and this is Colonel Adly Hogan Gladden, who owned them. And this is his wife. So I did more research and I looked up and I found out about the gallant Gladden. He fought in the Civil War and died at the Battle of Shiloh. And he owned this woman, who is my great-great-grandmother's sister. I've never seen my great-great-grandmother, but now at least I know what she kind of looked like because he described her. This is her husband, Horace Gandhi. Now this is important. In Mississippi and Oktibbeha County, not unlike in all these other counties across the nation, black people were fighting to maintain their rights that they acquired at the time of Reconstruction. 13th Amendment, the end of slavery. 14th Amendment, the right to citizenship and due process. And 15th Amendment, the right to vote and hold office. Again, Oktibbeha County, human suffering and the power of the human spirit. On this map, you'll see all of these sites. It's hard for you to read, but there's a church here. It's Chapel Hill Church. When my mother and I went to Mississippi, we drove through and we saw Chapel Hill Road. John Gandhi said, I hated going to Chapel Hill Church because when it snowed, I had to climb up that hill and it would get iced over and I could never quite get up the hill in time for school. When we drove down Chapel Hill Road, I looked to my right and there was this hill. And at the top was a church. And at the top was the church sign. And on the church sign was a bell. We rode over to the church. I jumped out of the car. The deacon came out. He said, how can I help you? And I told him the story. He said, well, yeah, this is the original church. The only thing we did was put brick on the outside and industrial carpeting down. And that bell, that's from the original school. This man and this man were part of that fight in Mississippi. They ultimately killed some Klan members in 1890, left Mississippi, and went to Indian Territory, which became Oklahoma in 1907. They also formed a delegation in 1905 to make Indian Territory the first all-black state. Of course, it became Oklahoma in 1907, and the first laws on the books were the segregation laws. So we get to this, casting the first ballot. Voting matters. And it matters how we make sure that it takes place. And it's not just voting, it's doing voter education. Because today we don't have any kind of civic education in school. And so here we have this image of the Harper's Weekly image, which is well known, of casting the first ballot. I'll have to get you the source for this, but this is from, it's from Friedman's area, and it's shown as casting the first vote. But I'll get you the source for that. So I thought it was really important to include that. And of course, there were all of these illustrations about the violence that went on. You'll see illustrations like this where people were approached at the polling sites, they were threatened, and oftentimes many people were killed. And then you also see some of these images that show not only African Americans, but you see some of the Irish people that were also treated the same way. And I find that very important because we talk about just our experiences, but it's a nuanced thing, and I think it's important for us to understand this shared history. This is my father, this is my grandfather. What they did every 2 years was we had our family reunions and we sat around in a circle. And in the middle of the circle, my grandfather sat with his sisters and they always told the family history every 2 years. And I never forgot it. And one of the things they shared was, our family was friends with Booker T. Washington. Well, I was a kid, I didn't know what that meant. But then one day I said, you know what, I heard our family was friends with Booker T. Washington. And my uncle said, we were. And Mary, would you please continue to do the research? He said that to me 2 days before he died, and I promised him I would. And so it's brought me to this. So I'm very honored to be able to share this story with you because all of us have these stories. All of us have these stories. So please keep digging, looking, and letting us know what this history is because the rest of the nation needs to know how deep our history goes in this nation. So thank you very much.